A routine traffic stop? A speeding car? A driver who should not exist? A cop pulls over a battered sedan expecting just another reckless driver. But when the young woman looks up at him, his world shatters, because staring back at him is his daughter, the girl he buried 5 years ago. Heart pounding, he demands her license, but the name on the ID isn't hers. The girl pleads with him, "Please, I have to go." Before he can react, she slams the gas and vanishes into the night. Shaken, desperate for answers, he runs her fingerprints, and what he finds is impossible. The system confirms it. This girl is his daughter. But if she's alive, who did he bury? And why is someone willing to kill to keep her past a secret? What happened the night she died? And what terrifying truth has been hidden all these years? This is a story of betrayal, redemption, and a father's fight to reclaim what was stolen. Stay till the end, because nothing is what it seems. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fog hung low over the empty highway, curling around the scattered streetlights like ghostly fingers. Officer Jack Hollister shifted in his patrol car seat, his muscles aching from sitting too long. The leather creaked beneath him as he tried to find a more comfortable position. Another quiet night in Redwood Falls. The same old routine of catching speeders and shooing away teenagers from the lookout point, where they parked their cars to watch the stars and do things their parents wouldn't approve of. He glanced at his watch. 12:15 a.m. The fluorescent numbers seemed to mock his fatigue. Maybe it was time to head back to the station. The coffee there was terrible, burnt and bitter, but at least it was hot. Anything to keep his eyes open for the rest of his shift. A flash of movement caught his eye. Through the thick mist, headlights suddenly blazed, cutting twin paths through the darkness. A car, old and beaten up, blew right through the stop sign at the intersection, not even slowing down. The metal sign wobbled in its wake. "Well, there goes my coffee break," Jack muttered, flipping on his sirens. The red and blue lights cut through the darkness as he pressed down on the gas pedal, the engine responding with a familiar growl. The old sedan ahead kept going for several seconds, wavering slightly as if the driver was debating whether to stop, the rear end swaying uncertainly. Finally, the car's brake lights glowed red and it pulled onto the gravel shoulder with a crunch of tires. Jack grabbed his flashlight, years of training kicking in as he approached. The car was a mess, rust eating away at the wheel wells like a cancer, a back bumper held on with what looked like wire, and tires that didn't match. The whole vehicle seemed to be held together by desperation and prayer. He tapped on the driver's window with his knuckles, keeping his other hand near his belt out of habit. The window rolled down with a grinding sound that made him wince, and Jack's heart stopped. The world tilted sideways. The flashlight beam illuminated a face he'd seen every day in the photographs on his mantle. A face he'd kissed goodnight thousands of times. A face he'd watched lowered into the ground 5 years ago, surrounded by roses and tears. Emily, his Emily. Jack's training warred with the thundering of his heart, which seemed to echo in his ears like drums. "License and registration, please," he managed to say, though the words felt like sand in his mouth. His tongue felt thick and clumsy. The girl, it couldn't be Emily, it couldn't, hesitated. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, pulling out a worn wallet that had seen better days. She handed over an ID card, her fingers shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Anna Grayson," it read, but the face in the photo was his daughter's face. The same gentle slope of her nose, the same curve of her cheek. Even the tiny scar above her eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bike at 8 years old. He remembered that day clearly, the tears, the Band-Aid, the chocolate ice cream he'd bought to make it better. "This can't be," Jack whispered, staring at the ID, then back at the girl. She looked exactly like Emily would have at 23. The same warm brown eyes that had always reminded him of her mother's. "Please." Her voice cracked, thick with desperation. "I have to go." She gripped the steering wheel so tight her knuckles went white. Jack's police instincts screamed at him to radio it in. Identity theft. A possible missing persons case. Something wasn't right. His hand moved toward his radio, fingers brushing the hard plastic. 20 years of procedure fought against 5 years of grief. The girl's eyes widened, darting between his face and his hand. In that split second, he saw raw fear flash across her features, his daughter's features, the kind of bone-deep terror that made his cop instincts sit up and take notice. Before he could react, she gunned the engine. The sedan's tires spun on the gravel, throwing stones in all directions like angry wasps. The car fishtailed onto the asphalt and shot forward, taillights disappearing into the fog like dying embers. Jack ran back to his patrol car, yanking his radio from his belt with shaking hands. "Dispatch, I have a suspect fleeing a traffic stop, possible stolen identity." He swallowed hard, his throat tight as a vice. "Female, early 20s, light brown hair." The word stuck in his throat as the impossible truth tried to claw its way out. "Driver looks exactly like my dead daughter." He threw the car into drive, tires squealing as he gave chase. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as the fog swallowed his cruiser, along with all the certainties he'd built his life around for the past 5 years. The patrol car's engine roared as Jack swerved onto the narrow back roads, his headlights cutting through the thickening fog. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under his desperate grasp. The sedan ahead of him, her car, weaved through the curves with the confidence of someone who knew every pothole and bend, someone who'd driven these roads countless times before. Come on," he muttered, pushing the cruiser harder. The speedometer crept past 60, dangerous on these twisted paths. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his mind raced faster than the car. That face. Those eyes. The same determined set of her jaw. It couldn't be her. He'd identified the body himself 5 years ago, had touched its cold skin with trembling fingers. The sedan's brake lights flashed red as it took a sharp left onto Dawson's Hollow. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening painfully. The dirt road was barely wide enough for one car, a shortcut only locals used. Emily used to take this route to school every morning, complaining about the dust it left on her blue Chevrolet. Gravel crunched under his tires as he followed, gaining ground. He flipped on his high beams, illuminating the back of her car. The sedan fishtailed suddenly, wheels spinning on loose rocks, sending a spray of pebbles into the darkness. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like she would lose control, but she somehow wrestled the car straight again with the skill of someone used to running. Jack grabbed his speaker, his fingers clumsy with urgency. "Pull over!" His voice boomed through the night, echoing off the trees, but the sedan only accelerated, engine whining in protest. Then the fog rolled in thick and heavy like a white wall rising from the ground, tendrils reaching across the road. Jack leaned forward, straining to keep the taillights in view. Just for a second, one terrible second, he glanced down at his dash. When he looked up, the red lights were gone, swallowed by the murky darkness. "No, no, no!" He slammed on his brakes, the cruiser sliding to a stop, tires screeching against loose gravel. Silence fell, broken only by the idle of his engine and his own ragged breathing, each exhale visible in the cold night air. He jumped out, flashlight beam cutting through the mist like a knife. Nothing. No tire tracks leading off the road. No sound of a distant engine. No broken branches to mark a crash. She'd vanished like smoke. 20 minutes of searching yielded nothing, not a single trace. Jack's hands trembled as he climbed back into his cruiser, his joints aching from the cold and tension. The dashboard clock mocked him. 12:47 a.m. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the sharp pain doing nothing to clear his head or slow his racing heart. Back at the station, Jack ignored the curious looks and whispered conversations from the night shift officers as he stormed to his desk. His computer hummed to life, and his fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up the DMV database. Anna Grayson, he typed, the name from her ID burning in his memory like a brand. Error. No match found. He tried other databases, state IDs, passports, birth records, social security numbers. Nothing. Anna Grayson didn't exist, just another ghost in the night. Jack sat back, running his hands through his graying hair, feeling every one of his 53 years. One option remained. One impossible, terrible option that would either confirm his madness or shatter his world completely. His hand shook as he opened the fingerprint database, the same one he'd used thousands of times over his career. He typed in the name that haunted his dreams, that whispered to him in the dark hours. Emily Hollister. The system whirred, processing, searching. Each second stretched like an eternity. Match found. The words blazed on his screen like an accusation, burning into his retinas. Jack stared at them, feeling the world tilt beneath him, reality crumbling at the edges. His coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of ceramic and cold coffee. No one came to check on the noise. They knew better than to disturb Officer Hollister when he was working late, especially since that terrible day 5 years ago. The fingerprint match blinked steadily on his screen, as real as the ground beneath his feet. As real as the grave he'd visited every Sunday for 5 years, leaving fresh flowers and unspoken apologies. As real as the face he'd seen tonight, the face of his daughter who was supposed to be dead but was now running from him like he was her worst nightmare. The morning sun painted long shadows across Pine Hill Cemetery as Jack stood before the familiar headstone, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The paper cup of gas station coffee trembled in his grip, dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. He hadn't slept since the chase, since seeing that face, her face. His whole body ached with exhaustion, but he couldn't rest, not with the questions burning through his mind. Emily Catherine Hollister, 1998 to 2018, he read aloud, his voice rough from exhaustion. The marble headstone stood pristine against the backdrop of fallen leaves, mocking him with its certainty. He'd visited this spot hundreds of times over the past 5 years, talking to a daughter he thought was gone forever. Sometimes he'd brought flowers, other times just his grief and guilt. Dead leaves crunched under his boots as he knelt beside the grave. His fingers brushed away the scattered foliage, touching the cold stone beneath. The memory of the funeral hit him like a physical blow. The closed casket, Marie's endless sobbing, the way she'd clutched his arm so tight it left bruises. The sky that day had been a perfect, cruel blue, just like today. Marie. His beautiful wife hadn't lasted long after Emily's death. The grief had eaten away at her until nothing remained but a shell, and then even that gave up. He'd lost them both, his whole world, in less than a year. The house still held echoes of their presence. Marie's favorite coffee mug in the cabinet, Emily's worn softball glove in the garage. But now, what if it had all been a lie? The thought made his stomach churn with equal parts hope and terror. Jack's legs felt heavy as he walked back to his car. The drive to the records office passed in a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. His hands kept tightening on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he approached the front desk, badge already in hand, the metal warm from being clutched so tightly. "I need to see Emily Hollister's death file," he said to the clerk, a thin woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. "Case number 2018-447. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. She hesitated, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "That's a sealed file, Officer Hollister. Even with your connection to the case." Her eyes held a mix of sympathy and bureaucratic stubbornness. "Please." His voice cracked. "I need to know." The desperation in his tone surprised even him. Something in his face must have moved her because she nodded and disappeared into the back. When she returned, she carried a thick manila folder, its edges worn from handling. Jack's hands shook as he opened it. The familiar accident report lay on top. Car found at the bottom of Miller's Ravine, burned beyond recognition. But as he dug deeper, the discrepancies began to surface. No DNA confirmation, no dental records. The coroner's report was vague, listing severe trauma as cause of death without specifics. Each missing detail felt like another crack in the foundation of what he'd believed for 5 years. His cop instincts screamed at him. How had he missed this? Grief had blinded him, made him accept what they told him without question. He'd been too broken to see what should have been obvious to any investigator. He requested the birth records next, desperate for anything that might make sense of this nightmare. Hours passed as he combed through databases and physical files, his coffee going cold beside him. Then, buried in a stack of old records, he found it. A sealed file under the name Anna Grayson, the pages yellow with age. The same name from the fake ID last night. His heart nearly stopped. Jack's heart pounded as he read the yellowed document. Anna Grayson, born 1998, same year as Emily. But according to the certificate, she'd been declared dead at birth. The coincidence was too perfect to be chance. Back in his car, Jack gripped the steering wheel until his fingers ached. The morning sun had climbed high, casting harsh light on the scattered papers in his passenger seat. His mind spun with questions, each more terrifying than the last. The implications were staggering. If Anna Grayson died at birth, he whispered to the empty car, who did I bury? The question hung in the air like smoke, suffocating in its possibilities. The fluorescent lights of Redwood Falls General Hospital buzzed overhead as Jack strode through the sterile corridors. His badge felt heavy in his hand as he approached the records department, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floors. The exhaustion from his sleepless night had been replaced by a burning determination that made his heart pound. Every step brought him closer to answers he both craved and feared. "Officer Hollister," he announced, holding up his badge to the young clerk behind the desk. His fingers gripped the metal harder than necessary. "I need access to some old files. Birth records from 1998. The clerk, a nervous-looking woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a name tag that read, Susan, wrung her hands. "Sir, those records are confidential. Even with a badge, we need—" "This is a criminal investigation," Jack cut in, his voice firm but controlled. The weight of 20 years of lies pressed against his chest. "I can have a warrant here in an hour, or you can help me now." She hesitated, glancing between his face and his badge, then nodded, disappearing into the back room. Jack drummed his fingers against the counter, scanning the quiet office. The wall clock ticked away precious seconds. A few minutes later, she returned with a stack of yellowed folders, the edges worn from years of storage. Jack settled at a small table in the corner, spreading out the files. His hands trembled slightly as he opened Anna Grayson's birth record, the paper crackling beneath his fingers. Time of death: 2:15 a.m. Cause: respiratory failure. But something caught his eye. The attending physician's signature. Dr. Marcus Wheeler. The same doctor who had pronounced Emily dead after her accident. The coincidence sent a chill down his spine. Jack's throat went dry. He pulled out his phone, punching in the number for the county coroner's office. As he waited, he flipped between the two files, the fluorescent light casting harsh shadows across the papers. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Identical blood types, similar birth weights. Even the handwriting on some of the forms seemed oddly matched, as if someone had filled them out at the same time, not years apart. His cop instincts screamed that something was very wrong. "County Coroner's Office," a tired voice answered. "This is Officer Jack Hollister. I need information about two cases, Anna Grayson, 1998, and Emily Hollister, 2018. His voice remained steady despite the tremor in his hands. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of typing. "Hold, please." While he waited, Jack noticed another name that appeared in both files. Owen Keating. His old partner had signed off on Emily's death certificate as the investigating officer. But his signature also appeared on a witness form in Anna's file 20 years earlier. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. Jack's hand shook as he ended the call and pulled up Owen's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring increasing the dread in his stomach. Then dash. "Jack?" Owen's voice was tight, controlled, with an edge he'd never heard before. "Whatever you think you found, you need to walk away. Now." The warning in his old partner's tone was unmistakable. The Silver Pines Inn loomed before Jack like something out of his worst nightmares. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crumbling parking lot, where abandoned shopping carts rusted between weed-filled cracks in the asphalt. The motel's neon sign buzzed and flickered, missing letters making it read SIERPIES. Perfect place to disappear, Jack thought, He'd seen enough dive motels in his years on the force to know this was where people went when they didn't want to be found. His body ached from the sleepless night, but his mind was razor sharp. The coffee in his system mixed with pure adrenaline, keeping him focused on one thing. Emily was alive. The truth of it hammered in his chest with each heartbeat. 5 years of grief and mourning, and now this. A ghost made flesh, driving through his jurisdiction at midnight. The motel's front office smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener, the kind that somehow made the air worse instead of better. A desk clerk, probably in his 50s, lounged behind a scratched plexiglass barrier. He didn't bother looking up from his phone, just kept chomping on a toothpick like it was his job. A small TV mounted in the corner blared daytime soap operas to no one in particular. Jack pulled out his badge, holding it up to the cloudy barrier. "Police. I'm looking for a guest. Anna Grayson." The clerk barely glanced at the badge. "Don't keep no register," he drawled, shifting the toothpick to the other side of his mouth. His worn t-shirt had seen better days, much like everything else in this place. Jack leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Listen carefully. Either you start remembering, or I make a call to licensing about all the health code violations I've counted in the last 30 seconds. The threat hung in the air. The clerk's jaw worked the toothpick faster, then he sighed. "Room 9, end of the hall." He pointed toward a dim corridor. "But I never told you nothing." He went back to his phone, deliberately avoiding Jack's eyes. Jack's heart pounded as he walked down the narrow hallway. The carpet, probably once red, had faded to a sickly brown, and the musty smell of decades of neglect filled his nostrils. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering like a strobe. Room 9's door looked like all the others, cheap wood with peeling green paint, brass numbers hanging crooked. A spider had made its home in the corner of the doorframe. He raised his fist and knocked. Silence. He tried again, harder this time, the hollow sound echoing down the empty corridor. Then, movement inside. Soft footsteps approached the door. Someone was there, hesitating. Jack held his breath, his pulse thundering in his ears. The door opened just a crack, and there she was. His daughter. She wore Emily's old leather jacket, the one she'd begged him to buy for her 16th birthday. The same jacket they'd buried her in, or thought they had. The sight of it made his chest constrict painfully. The color drained from her face when she saw him. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. She looked older, harder somehow, but those eyes, those were his Emily's eyes. Her fingers tightened on the door edge until her knuckles went white. "I don't know you," she said firmly, and slammed the door in his face. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Jack stood frozen outside room 9, his hand still raised to knock again. The peeling paint on the doorframe matched the worn state of his heart, battered but somehow still holding together. Through the thin walls he could hear movement inside, the soft scuff of shoes on carpet, and what sounded like drawers being hastily opened and closed. "Emily, I just need to talk." His voice came out gentler than he'd intended, closer to how he used to speak to her when she was little and scared of thunderstorms. Back when he could fix her problems with just a hug and a bedtime story. The silence stretched, broken only by a shaky breath from the other side. "I don't know you," she repeated, but her voice wavered this time, a tremor of uncertainty creeping in. Jack leaned closer to the door, pressing his palm against its surface. The wood felt cool beneath his fingers, grounding him in this surreal moment. "Then why are you wearing that jacket?" The leather jacket. He'd remember it anywhere. Emily had saved up babysitting money for months to buy it, wore it everywhere even in summer heat, despite her mother's constant protests about the heat. There was a soft click and the door opened just enough for him to see her face. Tears glistened in her eyes, threatening to spill over. The sight hit him like a physical blow. Her features were exactly as he remembered, yet somehow harder, marked by years he knew nothing about. "Please, just go," she whispered, fingers gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles went white. Jack felt his professional facade crumbling. "I buried you 5 years ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But you're here. and I need to know why." The words felt inadequate against the weight of all the questions burning inside him. A tear finally escaped, trailing down her cheek. Jack fought the urge to reach out and wipe it away, like he had done countless times when she was young. But before either of them could speak again, something changed in her expression. Her whole body tensed, eyes widening as they focused on something behind him. He recognized that look. Pure, instinctive fear. Jack's years of training kicked in. He turned sharply, his right hand automatically moving to rest on his holster. A black sedan had pulled into the parking lot, its engine purring quietly in the evening air. The windows were tinted so dark they looked almost solid, hiding whoever sat watching them. The car's sleek profile seemed to absorb what little light remained in the day. He heard the door snap shut behind him as Emily retreated into her room. The sedan sat there, engine idling, like a predator sizing up its prey. Then suddenly, the engine roared to life. The car peeled out of the lot, but not before Jack's trained eye caught the license plate. XK9. His blood ran cold. Those 3 letters and numbers had haunted him for years, part of an unsolved missing persons case that had gone cold despite his best efforts. He'd spent countless nights staring at that combination in case files, trying to make sense of it. Now here they were again, connected somehow to his daughter, who wasn't supposed to be alive. The sedan disappeared around the corner, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning rubber and too many questions. In the sudden silence, Jack could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, a reminder that this wasn't some fever dream. This was real, and his daughter was in danger all over again. The metallic thud of Jack's fist against the motel door echoed through the empty hallway, the cheap wood rattling in its frame. "Emily, open up. I need to get you out of here." His heart pounded as silence answered him, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then came the distinctive scrape of a window sliding open, followed by the soft rustle of curtains. "No, no, no," he muttered, already sprinting around the building, his police instincts screaming. The evening air had turned crisp, shadows lengthening across the cracked pavement like reaching fingers. He rounded the corner just in time to see Emily dropping from the first-floor window into the trash-strewn alley, her movements quick and practiced. "Emily, stop!" She took off running, her leather jacket flapping behind her like dark wings, her boots barely touching the ground. Jack pushed himself harder, boots pounding against broken concrete, his lungs burning with each breath. She darted between overflowing dumpsters and rusted fire escapes with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years running. Someone who knew every shortcut and hiding place these streets had to offer, who had learned survival the hard way. Sweat trickled down Jack's back despite the cool air, his shirt clinging uncomfortably to his skin. She was fast, faster than he remembered, her years on the run having honed her into something wild and elusive. But he knew these streets too, from countless patrols and sleepless nights searching for answers. When she twisted into a narrow side alley, he cut left through a loading dock, muscle memory guiding his feet, emerging just ahead of her. Emily skidded to a stop as Jack grabbed her wrist, gravel crunching under her feet. She struggled against his grip, eyes wild with terror like a trapped animal. Her breath came in sharp gasps that clouded in the cooling air. "You don't understand," she panted, trying to pull away, her pulse racing beneath his fingers. "You can't help me." Jack loosened his hold but didn't let go completely, afraid she'd disappear like smoke if he did. He softened his voice the way he used to when she had nightmares as a child, when the world was simpler. "Then help me understand." Her whole body trembled under his touch, fine shivers running through her frame. Tears spilled down her cheeks, catching the fading light as she whispered, "If they find me with you, they'll kill us both." The words hit Jack like ice water, freezing him to his core. Before he could respond, the crack of gunfire split the air, sharp and deadly. Glass exploded beside them as a bullet shattered a nearby window, sending crystalline shards raining down. Emily's scream pierced his ears, raw with terror. Jack's training kicked in, years of muscle memory taking over. He wrapped his arms around Emily, shielding her body with his own as another shot rang out, the sound bouncing off brick walls. The bullet whizzed past, too close, leaving a wake of disturbed air. He yanked her behind a dumpster, the metal cool against his back, drawing his service weapon in one fluid motion, the familiar weight steadying his hands. But when he peered around the edge, gun raised and ready, there was nothing but empty alley and lengthening shadows, the shooter melting away into the gathering dusk. The shooter had vanished, leaving only spent shell casings and questions in their wake. The streetlights cast long, ominous shadows as Jack's cruiser cut through the darkening, deserted streets. His knuckles were bone white against the steering wheel, every muscle in his body tense with heightened alertness. Next to him, Emily sat rigidly, her face turned toward the passenger window, watching the blurring scenery pass by. "You shouldn't have followed me," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine, tinged with a hint of resignation. Jack's jaw clenched tight enough to ache, his protective instincts flaring. "Someone just tried to kill you. You think I'm walking away now?" he retorted, his gruff tone betraying his deep concern. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped Emily's lips, laced with exhaustion. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she murmured, shaking her head slightly. He glanced at her profile, catching the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap, a clear sign of her inner turmoil. "Then tell me," he urged, his voice softening slightly. Silence filled the car once more as Emily pressed her forehead against the cool glass, stubbornly refusing to meet his gaze. Just as Jack was about to press her further, movement in his rear-view mirror caught his attention. A menacing black SUV swerved onto the road behind them, its blinding headlights blazing through the back window like relentless spotlights. Jack's stomach dropped as a chill of dread ran down his spine. Years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every one of them was screaming danger. Before he could react, the SUV slammed into their rear bumper, the impact jolting them forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. "Hold on," Jack shouted, gripping the wheel with both hands as the SUV rammed them again. The cruiser fishtailed, threatening to spin out of control. Emily grabbed the dashboard, her face pale with fear, her knuckles turning white. With a sharp turn of the wheel, Jack yanked the car off the road, narrowly missing a telephone pole. Gravel crunched under their tires as they skidded to a stop. His hand moved instantly to his weapon, ready to defend them against the unknown threat. The SUV stopped several yards away, its engine idling ominously. Two men stepped out, their faces hidden in the shadows. One of them called out across the distance, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Drop this, Hollister, you're digging up the wrong grave." Emily's fingers dug painfully into Jack's arm, her terror palpable. He could feel her trembling as he raised his weapon, but before he could squeeze the trigger, the men retreated to their vehicle. The SUV's tires spun in the gravel and it disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Jack turned to Emily, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his eyes searching her face for answers. She just stared at the empty road ahead, her silence heavier than any answer could have been, a clear indication that the danger they now faced was far greater than either of them could have imagined. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Jack's cramped office, casting harsh shadows across the worn carpet. Coffee cups and case files littered his desk, evidence of too many sleepless nights. His muscles screamed with every step as he paced back and forth, the memory of last night's SUV attack still fresh in his mind, the screech of metal, the sickening crunch of impact. Emily, or Anna, he still wasn't sure, was curled up on the vinyl bench against the wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, just stared at her hands with hollow eyes, occasionally rubbing at the bruise forming on her shoulder. Jack's phone felt heavy in his palm as he dialed the familiar number, his thumb hovering for just a moment before pressing the call button. 3 rings later, Owen Keating's gruff voice answered. "I need you here," Jack said simply. "Now." The words came out harder than he intended, but he couldn't soften them. 20 minutes later, Keating's heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, each step deliberate and measured. He filled the doorframe, his weathered face creasing with surprise when his eyes landed on Emily. Jack watched his old partner carefully, noting how Keating's hand twitched toward his hip, an old cop's instinct when something feels wrong. The gesture sent warning bells ringing in Jack's head. "Jesus Christ," Keating muttered, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. His face had gone a shade paler. Jack spread the evidence across his desk. The fingerprint match with its damning confirmation, the sealed adoption file with its suspicious redactions, photos of the black SUV's tire marks carved into the asphalt. Someone's trying to kill her, Owen. Last night they nearly ran us off the road. Another few inches and we'd both be dead. Keating picked up the fingerprint report, his expression unreadable beneath his practiced poker face. His eyes darted between the paper and Emily, who seemed to shrink smaller under his gaze, pressing herself further into the corner of the bench. "Walk away, Jack," Keating said, dropping the report back on the desk with a soft thud. "This isn't your fight. Some stones are better left unturned." Heat rose in Jack's chest, familiar anger burning through his veins. He planted both hands on his desk, leaning forward until he could smell the coffee on Keating's breath. "Someone tried to kill my daughter last night. I'm making it my fight." Keating rubbed his jaw, the stubble making a scratching sound in the quiet room. Sweat beaded at his hairline despite the office's chill. A long sigh escaped him as he studied Jack's face, searching for something. Finally, his shoulders dropped in resignation. "Then you'd better be ready for what you're about to dig up." Without another word, Keating turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall like a retreating thunderstorm. Jack watched him go, his gut churning with unease. The words felt like a threat wrapped in a warning. Behind him, Emily's voice broke the silence, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't trust him." Jack turned to face her, struck by how small and vulnerable she looked in the harsh lighting. "Why?" Emily's fingers twisted in the hem of her jacket, his daughter's jacket. She looked down, hesitating before speaking, as if the words themselves might bring danger. "Because I think he's the reason I don't remember my past." Jack's blood ran cold, turning to ice in his veins. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Redwood Falls nursing home as Jack and Emily walked down the sterile hallway. The smell of antiseptic and age hung in the air, mingling with the distant sound of a television and shuffling footsteps. Jack's mind was spinning with Emily's words about Keating, but he needed more answers. Emily stayed close to his side, her shoulders tense, eyes darting to each doorway they passed, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. Room 312. Jack knocked softly, his knuckles barely grazing the worn wood. A thin voice called, "Come in." Dr. Evelyn Carter sat in a worn armchair by the window, her silver hair neatly combed, hands folded in her lap. A faded quilt covered her knees, and a half-empty cup of tea sat cooling on the side table. Despite her frail appearance, her blue eyes were sharp and alert. She studied them carefully as they entered, her gaze lingering on Emily's face. "Dr. Carter," Jack said, keeping his voice low, mindful of the thin walls. "I'm Officer Hollister. This is—" He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Anna," Emily finished quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack pulled out his wallet and removed a worn photograph, its edges softened from years of handling. Emily at 16, laughing at her birthday party, her eyes bright with joy and innocence. He handed it to Dr. Carter. Her hands trembled as she took it, and her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. "Oh my," she whispered, touching the photo reverently. "I never thought, after all these years." "You signed her birth certificate," Jack said, as Emily Hollister. Dr. Carter's eyes filled with tears, making them glisten in the morning light. Her mother. She was so sure. She kept saying her baby couldn't be dead. But they showed her the death certificate. They made everything look official. So terribly official. "Who are they?" Jack pressed, leaning forward slightly. The doctor's fingers twisted in her lap, wringing the fabric of her sweater. Men in expensive suits. They came to the hospital regularly. Children would disappear, always ones from troubled homes or where the parents couldn't fight back. They swap children like pieces on a chessboard without a thought to the lives they destroy. Emily's breath caught, a small sound of distress escaping her. Jack reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, offering what comfort he could. "Who are these men?" Jack asked. "What organization?" Dr. Carter shook her head, fear flickering across her face like a shadow. I don't know. I never knew their names, but… She glanced at the door, lowering her voice to barely a breath. I know someone who might have answers. She reached for a notepad on her side table, her hand shaking as she wrote, the pen scratching against paper. Find Claire Dawson. She's been running from them for years. She knows more than I ever did. Emily suddenly gripped Jack's arm hard enough to hurt. Dad, she whispered, urgency in her voice. We need to go. Now. Jack followed her gaze to the hallway. A nurse pushed a metal cart past the open door, its wheels squeaking softly against the linoleum. Underneath, barely visible in the shadows, was a small red light blinking steadily. A recording device. They weren't alone anymore. Someone was listening, watching, waiting to strike. The gravel crunched under Jack's tires as he pulled into his secluded driveway. His house stood dark against the deepening twilight, surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the evening breeze. Emily hadn't spoken since they left the nursing home, her fingers constantly fidgeting with her shirt hem, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. We'll be safe here, Jack said softly, killing the engine. No one comes out this far. Not even my fellow officers visit anymore. Inside, Jack's house was sparse but clean, a bachelor's domain that spoke of long hours at work and little time for domesticity. Empty coffee cups lined the kitchen counter, and case files were scattered across his dining room table, evidence of endless nights spent searching for answers. Emily stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, taking in the space with wary eyes that darted between windows and exits. Jack retrieved a small box from his desk drawer, a DNA test kit he'd grabbed from the station's forensics lab earlier that morning. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, betraying the calm he tried to project. It's just a cheek swab, he explained, keeping his voice gentle, the way he used to speak to her when she was younger. Quick and painless, like brushing your teeth. Emily stared at the cotton swab like it was a loaded weapon, her face pale in the dim light. What if I don't want to know? She whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with fear. Jack lowered the test kit, his heart aching at her uncertainty. Then I'll stop right now. This is your choice, Emily. Everything from here on out is your choice. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath that seemed to steady her slightly. Number I need to know. Her voice strengthened with resolve. Do it. Jack carefully swabbed the inside of her cheek, then his own. The test processor hummed quietly on his kitchen counter, the minutes ticking by like hours as they waited. Emily paced restlessly, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, each turn more agitated than the last. Finally, the machine beeped. Jack's heart pounded as he read the results. Match found. The DNA confirmed what his heart had known since that first moment on the highway. Emily Hollister and Anna Grayson were the same person. His daughter was alive. No! Emily shook her head violently, backing away from the results, her hands raised as if to ward off the truth itself. No, it's a mistake. It has to be. Jack reached for her hands, trying to steady her, to anchor her in this moment. Emily, we know the truth now. We can fight this together. She yanked away from his touch, her eyes wild with fear and something deeper, a terror born of experience. You don't understand. If they took me once, they can take me again. Her voice cracked with panic, years of running evident in every word. Jack's stomach tightened into knots as a cold dread settled over him. Who are they, Emily? Who's after you? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she met his gaze, her next words shattering what remained of his world. They're the same people who tried to kill you 5 years ago. Jack's world tilted sideways, the room spinning around him as the implications of her words sank in, old wounds and suspicions suddenly blazing to life with newfound clarity. The dim lamp on Jack's desk cast long shadows across the makeshift home office, the flickering light casting an eerie glow over the cluttered space. Case files and newspaper clippings covered every available surface, the fragments of a puzzle that Jack had been unable to solve. The untouched whiskey in his glass caught the faint illumination, a silent testament to the weight of his thoughts. Emily lingered in the doorway, her shoulders hunched and her expression one of deep distress. Dark circles rimmed her eyes and her hands trembled visibly. "I don't want to remember," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. "But I think I already do." With careful, deliberate movements, Jack spread the files across his desk, his gaze intently focused. Emily's death certificate lay beside Anna Grayson's sealed adoption papers, and surrounding them were birth records, hospital forms, and police reports, a wealth of information he had meticulously gathered. One name kept jumping out at him, appearing in document after document: Owen Keating. The signature of his former partner was everywhere, from witness statements to medical releases and even the coroner's report. How had he missed these connections before? The implications were now impossible to ignore. "I know that name," Emily whispered, her face draining of color as a memory surfaced. There was a dark room. Men talking. I couldn't see their faces, but I heard them. She pressed her fingers to her temples, her breathing quickening. Someone kept whispering, "He can never know." Her voice shook with the weight of the recollection. Owen Keating was there when they took me. Jack's chest tightened with a surge of rage. His trusted partner, the man who had helped him search for Emily, who had stood beside him at her funeral, revealed as a liar. Grabbing his car keys from the desk, the metal biting into his palm, Jack turned towards the door. Emily stepped in front of him, her eyes wide with fear. "Where are you going?" Jack's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "To pay Keating a visit." "Jack?" Emily reached for his arm, but he shook her off, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving Emily alone in the shadowed office, her heart pounding with a sense of dread. The headlights cut through the darkness as Jack's car wound its way down the narrow country road leading to Keating's ranch. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, Emily's words haunting every mile. "Owen Keating was there when they took me." The memory of her voice, trembling with fear and certainty, made his stomach clench. The betrayal burned in his chest like acid. His partner, his friend, the man who'd stood beside him at Emily's funeral, who'd brought him coffee during those endless nights of searching, who'd patted his shoulder and promised they'd find answers. All of it. Lies built upon lies, each one cutting deeper than the last. Keating's ranch emerged from the darkness, a sprawling single story with weathered siding and dark windows. The moonlight cast long shadows across the overgrown lawn, making the place look abandoned and foreboding. Jack killed the engine, sitting in silence for a moment as crickets chirped in the distance. His hand brushed his holstered weapon, a habit born from years on the force, the familiar weight offering little comfort tonight. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the front door, each step measured and deliberate. No lights, but something moved behind the curtains, a shadow shifting in the darkness, quick and furtive. Jack's jaw tightened, muscles bunching beneath his skin. He knocked once, then harder when no one answered, the sound echoing in the still night air. "Keating, open the damn door!" The porch light flickered on, harsh and yellow. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Owen Keating stood there, looking decidedly unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. His shirt was half unbuttoned, a glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers, ice cubes clinking against the crystal. Jack ... Keating's voice was heavy with resignation. "You should have stayed out of this." Jack shouldered past him into the house, the familiar scent of tobacco and leather hitting him like a punch to the gut. He pulled the DNA results from his jacket, hands shaking with barely controlled rage. He slammed them onto Keating's coffee table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Tell me why my daughter is alive." Keating didn't even glance at the papers, his face a mask of practiced indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about." Something snapped in Jack, years of grief and betrayal crystallizing into pure fury. He grabbed Keating by the collar, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed photos. "Stop lying to me." The whiskey glass shattered on the floor, amber liquid seeping into the worn carpet. Keating sagged in Jack's grip, suddenly looking every one of his 50 years. He rubbed his face with trembling hands, the facade crumbling. "You think you know what happened," he said quietly, defeat creeping into his voice. "But you don't. Then tell me." Keating's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and regret that made Jack's skin crawl. "Emily's disappearance wasn't an accident. Someone higher up ordered it, Jack. I had no choice." "Names," Jack demanded, his grip tightening. "I want names. If I tell you, we're both dead." Keating's voice cracked like thin ice. "Walk away, Jack, before it's too late." Jack released him, disgust twisting his features as he stepped back. "I'm not walking away. Not this time." Keating's face darkened, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "Then God help you." Jack stormed out, the screen door banging behind him, but something made him pause at his car. Years of police work had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and right now, they were screaming that something wasn't right. The night had grown too quiet, too still. Through the window, he saw Keating already on his phone, pacing like a caged animal. Jack pulled out his own phone with steady hands, hitting record just in time to catch his former partner's words. "Yeah, he knows. We need to move her. Tonight." The blood in Jack's veins turned to ice, and the world tilted sideways. They still had Emily. All this time, they'd never let her go. Jack sat motionless in his car outside Keating's house, his heart hammering against his ribs. The recording on his phone played again, each word like a knife to his gut. "Yeah, he knows. We need to move her. Tonight." The voice was unmistakably Keating's, the same voice that had offered condolences at Emily's funeral 5 years ago. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white from the pressure. After 5 years of thinking his daughter was dead, he'd finally found her. And now these people, whoever they were, wanted to take her away again. The thought made him sick, bile rising in his throat as anger and fear warred inside him. Through the rearview mirror, he watched Keating's silhouette move behind the curtains, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. The man he'd trusted, shared beers with, worked cases with for 15 years. They'd been partners, friends even. All that time, Keating had known the truth about Emily, had looked Jack in the eye while keeping this secret. Jack started his car, keeping the headlights off as he pulled away from the curb. He needed to think, needed to plan. The dock at Crescent Lake, that's what Keating had said. But why there? What was waiting in those dark waters? His police instincts kicked in, telling him to call for backup. But who could he trust? If Keating was involved, how deep did this go? He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers, dialing Emily's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. His stomach clenched into a tight knot. "Come on, Emily," he muttered, dialing again. Straight to voicemail this time. The cheerful recording of her voice felt like another twist of the knife. The speedometer crept higher as he raced down the empty streets toward home, streetlights flashing past in a blur. Maybe she was just sleeping. Maybe she'd turned her phone off, maybe... His mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. But as he turned onto his street, he knew. Something was wrong. The porch light he always left on was dark, a black void where warmth should be. And the front door, he could see it even from here, stood wide open, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Jack slammed on the brakes, gravel crunching under his tires like broken glass. He drew his service weapon, the familiar weight offering little comfort as he approached the house with practiced caution. Wind whistled through the open door, making the hinges creak an eerie welcome. "Emily?" he called out, sweeping his flashlight across the entrance. No response, just the hollow echo of his voice bouncing off the walls. Inside, chaos greeted him. The coffee table was overturned, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. A lamp lay shattered near the wall, its broken pieces glinting in his flashlight beam. Signs of a struggle. And Emily, his daughter, who he'd only just found again after all these years, was gone. A crumpled piece of paper caught his eye near the stairs. He picked it up with shaking hands, dreading what he might find. It was the DNA test results from earlier, proving Emily's true identity. Across it, written in harsh black marker, "You should have listened." The words seemed to mock him, a reminder of how badly he'd failed to protect her. Again. Jack burst through his front door, his police training kicking in as he swept the house room by room, gun drawn. The living room was a disaster. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, picture frames smashed on the floor. His heart pounded like a jackhammer as he called out, "Emily!" No answer. Just the eerie silence of an empty house that seemed to mock his growing desperation. He moved through the kitchen, noting the knocked-over chairs and broken glass crunching beneath his boots. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. A dented wall, droplets of blood on the tile. Emily hadn't gone willingly. The thought made his stomach turn with a sickening lurch. Something caught his eye, a cheap burner phone lying on the floor near the back door, its black plastic case scratched and dirty. As he bent to pick it up, it buzzed in his hand like an angry wasp. The screen lit up with an unknown number casting a pale blue glow in the darkened kitchen. Jack's fingers trembled slightly as he answered. "Hello? You should have listened, Jack." Keating's voice was calm, almost smug, dripping with self-satisfaction. The familiar tone made Jack's blood boil in his veins. "Where is she?" Jack demanded, his voice raw with fury and fear. "I swear to God, Keating, if you hurt her—" A low chuckle cut him off. "It's out of my hands now, but you might still have a chance, if you get to Crescent Lake before sunrise. Time's ticking, Jack." Jack's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. "You set me up. You knew I'd go confront you. Give you time to grab her. This was your plan all along." "No, Jack," Keating sighed like a disappointed teacher addressing a slow student. "You did this to yourself. I warned you to walk away. Now you get to live with the consequences." Rage exploded through Jack's chest like a blast furnace. He slammed the phone down on the counter, cracking the screen. His hands were shaking with fury as he grabbed his car keys and sprinted for the door, leaving it wide open behind him. The pre-dawn air was crisp and biting as he jumped into his cruiser. The engine roared to life like an angry beast, tires squealing as he peeled out of the driveway, leaving rubber marks on the asphalt. His mind raced faster than the speedometer, playing out worst-case scenarios. Crescent Lake was 15 minutes away, if he broke every speed limit between here and there, and he would. Streetlights blurred past in golden streaks as he pushed the cruiser to its limits, the engine whining in protest. Whatever was waiting for him at that lake, whatever sick game Keating and his people were playing, it ended tonight. He wouldn't lose Emily again, not this time, not ever again. The radio crackled to life with static and voices. Dispatch calling his unit number, demanding a response. Jack ignored it, his jaw clenched tight as he focused on the road ahead, weaving through the sparse early morning traffic as he sped toward Crescent Lake. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of gray. Dawn was coming, and with it, either salvation or catastrophe. The gravel crunched under Jack's tires as he pulled up to Crescent Lake, killing his headlights. Dawn was just beginning to break, casting an eerie glow through the thick fog rolling off the water. The old pines that lined the shore stood like silent sentinels in the half-light. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spotted them. 3 dark figures standing near the weathered dock, their silhouettes distorted by the morning mist. Emily stood with her hands bound behind her back, her face pale with fear, dark hair whipping in the cold morning breeze. Beside her was Keating, his former partner's shoulders tense and rigid, fingers twitching near his service weapon. But it was the third figure that made Jack's blood run cold. A tall, well-dressed man he didn't recognize, his features obscured by the dense fog, expensive suit out of place in these rustic surroundings. Jack stepped out of his car, drawing his weapon in one fluid motion, years of training taking over despite the tremor in his hands. "Let her go," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. The lake water lapped quietly against the shore, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. The mystery man's chuckle cut through the morning air like a blade. "You're in no position to make demands, Officer Hollister." His tone was smooth, cultured, the voice of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. Keating shifted uncomfortably, looking at Jack with something close to regret in his eyes, his face lined with guilt and exhaustion. "I told you to walk away from this, Jack. Why couldn't you just listen? Some things are bigger than both of us." "Finish this," the well-dressed man commanded Keating, his patience clearly wearing thin, manicured fingers drumming against his thigh. "Jack, don't—" Emily's whispered warning was cut short as the mystery man let out an annoyed sigh, his composure cracking for just a moment. "If you want something done right," he pulled out a silenced pistol with practiced ease, the weapon appearing in his hand like a magic trick, leveling it at Emily's head. The gunshot cracked through the morning silence like shattering glass. Emily's scream pierced the air as Jack fired back instinctively, his bullet finding its mark in one of the approaching bodyguards he hadn't noticed before, hidden by the fog and shadows. The man went down with a grunt, clutching his shoulder. Jack launched himself forward, tackling Keating to the ground with bone-jarring force. His fist connected with his former partner's jaw as Emily struggled against her restraints nearby, the zip ties cutting into her wrists. Through the chaos, the mystery man melted into the fog like a ghost, his expensive shoes leaving pristine prints in the damp earth. "Who are you?" Jack shouted after him, his voice raw with rage and desperation, echoing across the still water. The answer drifted back through the mist, chilling Jack to his core. "Someone who's been cleaning up your mess for years, Hollister. Did you really think your daughter's accident was random?" Jack froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. That voice. He knew that voice. It belonged to someone he had trusted, someone who had been there all along, attending Emily's funeral, offering condolences, watching him grieve. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the morning air as Jack rushed to Emily's side, his hands trembling slightly as he worked to untie the ropes around her wrists. The rough fiber had left angry red marks on her skin, deep grooves that told the story of her desperate struggle. Behind them, Keating let out a pained groan, clutching his shoulder where Jack's bullet had caught him, blood staining his jacket a dark crimson. "Don't move," Jack ordered, pressing his gun against Keating's temple with enough force to make his point clear. "Who is he? Who's behind this?" Keating's face twisted into a grimace, blood seeping between his fingers and dripping onto the forest floor. "You already know," he spat through clenched teeth. Jack yanked him roughly to his feet, ignoring another grunt of pain. Emily backed away from them both, her eyes fixed on the tree line where the mystery man had vanished into the fog. Her whole body was shaking, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "This isn't over," Keating said with a bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. "You think you've won something here? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Not even close." Jack slammed him against the nearest tree trunk, bark cracking under the impact. "Then start talking. Now." Keating's eyes met his, and for a moment Jack saw something like pity there, mixed with a hint of fear. "He was your boss, Jack. He was watching you the whole time. Every move, every investigation." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. His grip on Keating's collar loosened as understanding dawned. "You mean—" Keating nodded slowly, a thin smile spreading across his pale face. "Captain Henry Lawson." The name hung in the air between them like poison, turning Jack's stomach. His world tilted sideways as memories crashed over him. Lawson, the man who'd taken him under his wing when he was just a rookie, showing him the ropes, who'd promoted him to detective with a proud smile and a firm handshake, who'd stood beside him at Emily's funeral, one hand on his shoulder, promising they'd find whoever was responsible. It had all been lies. Emily's voice cut through his shock, small but determined. "What now?" Jack's jaw tightened as he stared at Keating, rage building in his chest like a gathering storm. "We go after him, and this time we finish it." The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of the police station as Jack burst through the doors, Emily close on his heels. The usual morning bustle of the precinct fell silent. Officers froze, coffee cups halfway to their mouths as they stared at the girl everyone thought was dead. Some faces showed confusion, others a flicker of recognition that made Jack's skin crawl. Whispers started to ripple through the room like a wave, and the air grew thick with tension. He stormed straight to Lawson's office, shoving the door open so hard it bounced against the wall with a thunderous crack. Captain Henry Lawson sat behind his massive oak desk, perfectly composed in his crisp uniform, not a wrinkle in sight. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he stirred it methodically, like this was any other morning, the silver spoon catching the morning light. "Jack," Lawson said smoothly, his voice carrying that familiar fatherly tone that now made Jack's stomach turn. "You look terrible. Rough night?" Jack's hands shook with rage as he threw the DNA file onto Lawson's desk, scattering papers across the polished surface. Several sheets floated to the floor like autumn leaves. "Tell me why my daughter is alive." Lawson didn't even glance at the file. He just kept stirring his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic, a steady rhythm like a ticking clock. "Because I let her be." "You ordered the hit on me 5 years ago, didn't you?" Jack's voice was barely controlled, each word sharp enough to cut. Lawson took a deliberate sip of coffee before answering, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. "Yes, I did." Emily gasped behind Jack, the sound small and wounded. His fingers twitched instinctively toward his holster, every muscle in his body screaming to draw his weapon. Sweat trickled down his back despite the morning chill. Lawson set his cup down with a soft clink and leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed by Jack's barely contained fury. The leather creaked beneath him as he settled. "You got too close to the wrong case, Jack. I had to clean it up. That's what good leaders do." "By taking my daughter?" Jack's voice cracked with disbelief, the words raw in his throat. "She was just collateral damage." Lawson shrugged like they were discussing paperwork instead of a stolen life. "We needed leverage, insurance, if you will." Jack's mind raced through years of memories, every time Lawson had mentored him, promoted him, praised him like a son. The fishing trips, the late-night talks, the career advice. All of it had been a lie. The betrayal cut so deep it felt like a physical wound burning in his chest. Lawson rose from his chair, straightening his jacket with practiced ease. His gold badge caught the morning light. "I have men everywhere, Jack. You're outnumbered. Always have been." Jack glanced through the office windows at the officers outside, trying to read their faces. Some avoided his gaze, others watched with predatory interest. How many were loyal to Lawson? How many knew the truth about what happened that night? Before he could move, Emily darted forward. In one fluid motion, she yanked Jack's gun from his holster and aimed it steadily at Lawson's chest. Her hands didn't shake at all. "Then let's see how fast they can react," she said coldly, her finger resting on the trigger. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lawson's office as Jack's fingers wrapped around Emily's wrist, gently but firmly pushing the gun down. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady, carrying the weight of years of police training. "Not like this." Lawson's smirk deepened, his eyes cold and calculating beneath the fluorescent lights. "Good instincts, Jack, but it's too late." He leaned back in his leather chair, radiating smug confidence. The office door burst open with a bang that made Emily flinch. 2 officers dragged in a barely conscious Keating, blood seeping through his white shirt where Jack's bullet had grazed him. They roughly deposited him in a chair where he slumped forward, breathing heavily, his face pale and drawn with pain. Lawson gestured toward Keating with a casual wave of his manicured hand. "See? Even your friends are liabilities." His voice dripped with contempt, each word carefully chosen to wound. "Did you really think you could win this?" Jack's jaw tightened, anger burning hot and fierce in his chest. "You think you own this town?" His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "I do." Lawson stood, straightening his silk tie with practiced precision. "And in an hour, no one will remember you were ever here." He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over the screen like an executioner's axe. "One call and you both disappear. Forever this time." Emily's hand found Jack's arm, her fingers trembling against his sleeve. "Jack," she whispered, voice tight with fear, her survival instincts screaming. "We have to go." Her eyes darted between the armed officers filling the doorway, counting weapons, assessing threats. They were trapped, outgunned, outnumbered in what should have been a place of justice. Jack noticed Keating's gaze shift toward the wall, toward the red emergency alarm switch mounted beside the filing cabinet. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the tension-filled room. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and lies, Jack saw something familiar in his old partner's face. A flicker of the man he'd once trusted with his life, a chance at redemption. Without warning, Jack lunged forward, throwing his whole body into Lawson's heavy oak desk. It toppled with a thunderous crash, sending papers, pens, and coffee flying in all directions. In the same instant, Keating lurched from his chair, slamming his fist into the emergency alarm with the last of his strength. The station erupted into chaos. Sirens wailed through the corridors, emergency lights strobed against the walls, and confusion spread like wildfire through the building. Jack grabbed Emily's hand, his grip fierce and protective, feeling her pulse race against his palm. "Run!" Gunshots exploded behind them as they bolted through the door, the sound nearly drowned out by the blaring alarm. Bullets splintered the doorframe inches from their heads as they dove around the corner, racing toward freedom, toward a chance to expose the truth that had been buried for far too long. Tires screamed against asphalt as Jack yanked the stolen police SUV around another corner, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Emily clutched the dashboard, her face pale as morning sunlight flashed between buildings. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely breathe. "How many?" Jack asked, checking the rearview mirror, his weathered face tight with concentration. "At least 5 cruisers." Emily's voice shook. Red and blue lights flooded the streets behind them, sirens wailing through the quiet morning. The sound seemed to echo off every building, surrounding them in a cocoon of noise. Jack swerved to avoid a delivery truck, the SUV's tires catching the curb before straightening out. The impact rattled their teeth. His police radio crackled with Lawson's voice cold and precise. "All units shoot to kill. I repeat, shoot to kill." A bullet shattered the back window, sending glass shards spraying across the back seat. Emily screamed, ducking lower in her seat, covering her head with trembling hands. "We're not going to make it." "Yes, we are." Jack's jaw clenched as he spotted the industrial yard ahead, his eyes scanning for any advantage. Chain-link fences and abandoned warehouses might give them cover. He yanked the wheel hard, the SUV fishtailing as they crashed through a gate, metal screeching against metal. Through the mirror, he saw Lawson's car leading the pursuit, gaining ground with every second. More shots rang out, pinging off the SUV's frame. Jack weaved between storage containers, hoping to lose them in the maze of metal and concrete. Sweat trickled down his temple as he navigated the narrow passages. But his heart sank as they rounded the final corner. A solid wall of concrete rose before them, blocking any escape. Dead end. The wall seemed to mock them, gray and impenetrable in the morning light. Jack slammed the brakes, the SUV sliding to a stop in a cloud of dust and gravel. Sirens grew louder, closing in from all sides like wolves circling their prey. Emily grabbed his arm, terror in her eyes. "Jack, ... Police cruisers surrounded them, boxing them in with military precision. Doors opened with synchronized thuds. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, using their cars as cover. Jack recognized faces. People he'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, trusted. Now aiming guns at his head. Lawson stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie with casual precision, as if he were preparing for a business meeting rather than a confrontation. His smile was cold as he approached, gun held loosely at his side, every movement calculated to demonstrate his complete control of the situation. "Game over, Jack." A bullet shattered the rear window with an explosive crack, making Emily scream and duck lower in her seat. Glass fragments rained down as Jack's mind raced, his knuckles white on the steering wheel while he weaved through the industrial yard's maze of rusted warehouses and towering shipping containers. "They're boxing us in!" Emily shouted, gripping her seatbelt so tight her fingers ached. Sweat trickled down her neck as another shot pinged off the trunk. Jack spotted a narrow alley between two buildings barely wider than their vehicle. It was their only chance. He yanked the wheel hard, metal scraping against brick with a horrific screech as they squeezed through. Sparks flew from both sides as paint and metal peeled away. The pursuing cruisers would have to go around. No way they'd fit through this gap. "Jack," Emily pointed ahead, terror in her voice. A chain-link fence stretched between the buildings, topped with razor wire. Dead end. Jack slammed the brakes, the SUV's tires screaming against pavement as they skidded to a stop. Behind them, sirens grew closer, their wailing echoing off the warehouse walls. They were trapped like rats in a cage. "Get down and stay down," Jack ordered, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. He pulled his backup weapon from his ankle holster, checking the magazine with practiced movements. Emily nodded, sliding onto the floor and making herself as small as possible. Police cruisers surrounded them in a semicircle, their red and blue lights painting the alley in harsh colors. Officers took position behind their doors with weapons drawn, the air thick with tension. Lawson stepped out of the lead car with deliberate slowness, adjusting his silk tie with a smug smile that made Jack's blood boil. "It's over, Jack," Lawson called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Come quietly, and maybe your daughter lives. It's really quite simple." Jack's jaw clenched until his teeth ached. Then he noticed something through the sea of drawn weapons, a familiar face in the crowd of officers. Detective Sarah Martinez, his old friend from Internal Affairs, stood slightly apart from the others. She caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, her hand shifting on her weapon. "You're right about one thing, Lawson," Jack shouted back, buying time. "It is over." Martinez suddenly raised her weapon, not at Jack, but at Lawson's chest. "Everyone stand down," she commanded with steel in her voice. "Captain Lawson, you're under arrest." More officers shifted their aim in confusion, some pointing at Lawson, others staying trained on Jack. Uncertainty rippled through the ranks as partners found themselves on opposite sides. "What is this?" Lawson demanded, his composure cracking. Martinez held up her phone like a shield. "That call you just made? It was recorded. We've been building a case against you for months, gathering evidence piece by piece. The FBI's on their way. They're very interested in what you've been hiding." "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Lawson snarled, his facade of civility completely gone. "Actually, we do," came another voice. Keating limped forward from behind a cruiser, blood still staining his shirt where Lawson's men had shot him. "I've been working with Internal Affairs since you ordered the hit on Jack. We needed proof of how deep this went, how far the corruption spread." Emily peered over the dashboard, her eyes wide with dawning understanding. "The children. There were others like me, weren't there? Other families you destroyed?" Lawson's face twisted into something ugly. "You think this ends with me? I'm just one piece of the puzzle, one cog in the machine. The organization I work for, they're everywhere. In every department, every city. You'll never—" A single gunshot cracked through the air like thunder. Lawson stumbled backward, red blooming across his expensive suit. Chaos erupted as officers dove for cover behind vehicles and crates. "Sniper!" Martinez shouted above the pandemonium. "Get down!" Multiple shooters. Jack grabbed Emily and pulled her close against his chest, shielding her with his body as bullets peppered the ground around them. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of dark figures retreating across a nearby rooftop, their movements precise and practiced. Lawson's real masters making sure he couldn't reveal their secrets. The truth was bigger than any of them had imagined, a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. And it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Martinez and her team returned fire at the rooftop while other officers secured Lawson, who lay bleeding but alive on the pavement. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air as FBI support arrived, spotlights cutting through the growing darkness. "Dad," Emily whispered, gripping Jack's arm with trembling fingers. "What do we do now?" Jack held his daughter close, watching as federal agents swarmed the scene like angry hornets. His voice was soft but determined. "Now we find out who really took you. And we make them pay, every last one of them." Lawson's men formed a tight circle around the SUV, weapons trained on Jack and Emily. The morning sun cast long shadows across the industrial yard, glinting off police badges and gun barrels. Steam rose from rusted pipes nearby, adding an eerie haze to the tense standoff. Jack's heart pounded as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, scanning for any possible escape route. But they were completely boxed in by the wall of armed officers. "Game over, Jack," Lawson called out, stepping forward with that infuriating smirk on his face. He adjusted his expensive suit jacket like this was just another day at the office, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "You never should have come back." Emily's fingers dug into Jack's arm, leaving half-moon marks in his skin. "We're trapped." Her voice trembled, but there was steel beneath the fear, the same determination he remembered from when she was young. Jack released a sharp breath, his mind racing through scenarios. "Not yet." Lawson gestured casually to his men like a conductor directing an orchestra. "Get them out." Moving slowly, deliberately, Jack stepped out first, hands raised in surrender. The morning air bit cold against his face. Emily followed, her jaw set in defiance, chin lifted high. The officers moved in, weapons at the ready, but Jack noticed something in their expressions. Uncertainty, hesitation, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. These weren't just Lawson's puppets. These were men and women he'd worked with for years, shared coffee with, trusted with his life, celebrated birthdays and promotions with. Jack straightened his shoulders, meeting their gazes one by one. "You all really want to go down for this bastard?" Several officers shifted uncomfortably, lowering their weapons slightly. Lawson's laugh cut through the tension like a knife. "They won't listen to you, Jack. You're a fugitive now, nothing but a dirty cop." Emily suddenly stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the yard, echoing off metal containers and concrete walls. "You stole me. You destroyed our lives." Her hands clenched into fists, shaking with rage. "How many others have you done this to? How many families have you torn apart?" For the first time, Lawson's composed mask cracked. His face darkened with genuine anger, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You wouldn't understand, girl. You were supposed to disappear. Just another tragic accident." Something snapped inside Jack. All the rage, all the pain of the past 5 years, every sleepless night and empty morning exploded in a single moment. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with Lawson's jaw in a satisfying crunch that sent the man staggering backward. Chaos erupted. Gunshots cracked through the air as officers scattered, diving for cover, unsure whose orders to follow. Jack grabbed Emily's hand and sprinted toward an old maintenance tunnel he'd spotted earlier, praying his memory of the building plans was accurate. A bullet tore through his shoulder, hot pain lancing down his arm like liquid fire. "Take him alive!" Lawson's furious voice echoed behind them, thick with blood from his split lip, as they plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. The sound of pounding footsteps followed close behind. Jack stumbled through the dimly lit maintenance tunnels, his shoulder burning where the bullet had grazed him. Blood seeped through his fingers as he pressed against the wound, each step sending jolts of pain through his body. Emily held his other arm, helping him stay steady as they navigated the maze-like passages, her grip firm but gentle. Above them, heavy boots thundered on concrete, the sound growing more intense with each passing moment. Voices echoed down through metal grates, sharp commands bouncing off the walls. Lawson's men were getting closer, their footsteps like a countdown to disaster. "We can't keep running forever," Emily whispered, her voice tight with worry. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion as she guided Jack around a corner, deeper into the darkness. The dank air clung to their skin, thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. Jack nodded, trying to catch his breath between waves of pain. "We don't have to. We just have to last long enough." With his good arm, he pulled out his phone, hands trembling slightly. The screen's glow illuminated his face in an eerie blue light as he checked that it was still recording. Everything Lawson had said, every threat, every admission, it was all captured, their one chance at justice. The tunnel opened into a wider junction, the ceiling stretching higher above them. Rusty pipes lined the walls, dripping with condensation that created small puddles on the concrete floor. A service ladder stretched upward, leading to what looked like a storm drain cover. Jack squinted at it through the pane, hope flickering in his eyes. "That's our way out," he said, gritting his teeth against the throbbing in his shoulder. "Help me up." Emily steadied him as he gripped the first rung, her hands hovering near his waist in case he slipped. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his shoulder, making his vision blur at the edges. Blood trickled down his arm, leaving dark spots on the metal rungs like breadcrumbs marking their escape. Emily followed close behind, watching anxiously as Jack struggled upward, her heart pounding with every grunt of pain he made. The cover was heavy, but Jack managed to push it aside with his good shoulder, metal scraping against metal. Fresh air and daylight poured in, almost blinding after the darkness below. They emerged into an overgrown area near old railroad tracks, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ground. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete, and abandoned train cars sat rusting on parallel lines, silent witnesses to their desperate flight. "Jack ... Emily's voice caught in her throat, fear making it barely more than a whisper. "Look." Jack turned, his heart sinking like a stone in his chest. Owen Keating stood 20 feet away, partially hidden in the shadow of a boxcar, his familiar silhouette a harbinger of doom. But unlike their last encounter, this time his gun was raised and pointed directly at them, the barrel as black as his intentions. The rusted train cars loomed around them like steel giants in the afternoon sun, their shadows stretching across the gravel like dark fingers reaching for prey. Jack's heart stopped when he saw Keating standing there, gun raised and aimed straight at his head. Blood from his shoulder wound trickled down his arm in warm rivulets as he raised his hands slowly, fighting against the searing pain. Emily moved instantly, placing herself between them, her body trembling but determined. "No, please," she begged, voice trembling with desperate emotion. "You don't have to do this. There has to be another way." Keating's weathered face showed pain, deep lines etching themselves deeper as his gun hand trembled slightly. "I told you to walk away, Jack." His voice was rough with emotion, carrying years of buried guilt. "And I told you I wouldn't," Jack replied firmly, despite the burning in his shoulder that threatened to overwhelm him. His jaw clenched against the pain. Keating's hands shook more visibly now, the afternoon sun catching the silver in his hair. "You don't get it, Jack. Lawson doesn't lose. He never has. He destroys everything he touches." Jack took a careful step forward, ignoring Emily's worried glance and the way his vision swam. "Then help us beat him. For once in your life, Owen, do the right thing. Help us end this." A bitter laugh escaped Keating's throat, hollow and haunted. "It's too late for that. Way too late. Some sins can't be washed away." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she stared at the man who had changed her life forever, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "You were there when they took me. Why? I need to know." The question seemed to hit Keating like a physical blow, making him flinch visibly. His gun lowered slightly as pain crossed his face, aging him 10 years in an instant. "Because I had a choice, lose you or lose Jack." "What?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, his blood running cold as the implications hit him like a sledgehammer. Keating's shoulders sagged as the truth finally spilled out, his face a mask of torment. 5 years ago, Lawson ordered me to kill you, Jack. Said you were getting too close to something big. When I refused..." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He took Emily instead. Made me help stage the accident." Jack felt like he'd been punched in the gut, his wound forgotten in the wake of this revelation. "You let me think she was dead." The words came out raw, accusatory, laden with 5 years of grief and loss. "And I've been paying for it ever since," Keating admitted, his voice heavy with regret and self-loathing. "Every single day." In the distance, sirens began to wail, their haunting cry cutting through the heavy air. The sound grew louder with each passing second, echoing off the train cars like a chorus of doom. Lawson's men were closing in, bringing death with them. Without warning, Keating tossed his gun to Jack, who caught it reflexively despite his injured shoulder. "Go. Take Emily and run. Don't look back." Jack hesitated, the weight of the weapon heavy in his hand, understanding the sacrifice being offered. "What about you?" A sad smirk crossed Keating's face, a glimpse of the man he used to be shining through. "I was never getting out of this alive. Maybe this way, I can finally make things right." Gunfire suddenly erupted from behind them, bullets pinging off metal with deadly precision. Keating spun around, drawing a second weapon from beneath his jacket as he turned to face his former boss, ready to buy Jack and Emily the time they needed to escape, determined to make his final stand count for something. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Redwood Falls City Hall. Cameras flashed and microphones jutted forward as Jack stepped up to the podium, his shoulder still aching from the bullet graze that served as a constant reminder of last week's shootout. Emily stood beside him, her face bearing fresh bruises but her eyes blazing with determination. Her fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of her jacket, a nervous habit she'd developed during her years on the run. Across the street, Captain Henry Lawson lounged against his department SUV, surrounded by his loyal officers like a king holding court. His smirk said it all. He thought he was untouchable, just as he had for the past 20 years. Jack's hand brushed the recorder in his pocket, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. "This town has been run by corruption for too long," Jack's voice boomed through the speakers, echoing off the courthouse columns. "And today, it ends." The crowd hushed as Jack pulled out the recorder, the small device feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. His finger hovered over the play button, meeting Lawson's gaze across the street. The captain's smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his perfectly composed face. The recording crackled to life. Lawson's voice filled the square, crystal clear and damning. "You were supposed to disappear, Emily." Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling frantically in their notepads, hunger for the story evident in their eyes. Jack was getting too close. We had to remove him. More damning confessions played out, each one worse than the last. The trafficking ring that had destroyed countless lives, the covered-up murders of witnesses who dared to speak up, Emily's kidnapping and the elaborate scheme to erase her identity. With each revelation, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, a rising tide of outrage. Camera flashes intensified, lightning in the afternoon sun. Lawson's face transformed from confident to murderous, his mask of respectability crumbling away to reveal the monster beneath. His hand moved to his waistband, pulling his service weapon with practiced ease. Several people screamed, the crowd beginning to scatter. But before he could aim, a single shot cracked through the air like thunder. Lawson staggered backward, clutching his chest in disbelief. Blood bloomed across his pristine white shirt like a grotesque flower. He collapsed onto the pavement, his authority evaporating in an instant. Emily stood firm, gun still raised, wisps of smoke curling from the barrel like ghostly fingers. Her hands trembled slightly, but her aim had been true, just as she'd learned during those lonely years of running and surviving. "Emily!" Jack started, reaching for her, his heart breaking for what his daughter had been forced to become. She lowered the weapon slowly, tears streaming down her face, leaving tracks through the light dust on her cheeks. "It's over, Dad." Her voice cracked with emotion, years of fear and anger finally finding release. Police officers, the honest ones who'd been waiting for this moment, swarmed in from their hidden positions. They cuffed Lawson as paramedics rushed to treat him, their sirens wailing in the distance. The cameras kept flashing, capturing every moment of the corrupt captain's downfall, his empire crumbling around him. The nightmare that had haunted them for 5 years was finally over, leaving father and daughter to begin the long process of healing together. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across the metal table. Jack's body ached from the events of the past few days, his muscles stiff and protesting with each small movement. But his mind remained sharp as he watched District Attorney Mark Reynolds leaf through the thick folder of evidence. The manila folder was stuffed to bursting with photos, statements, and documentation of their case. Emily sat beside him, both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup she hadn't touched. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, matching the fading bruises on her face that had turned a sickly yellow-green. She hadn't slept much since Lawson's arrest. The nightmares kept her awake most nights, though she tried to hide it. Reynolds adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, nodding as he reviewed another document. The fluorescent light glinted off the lenses as he moved. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone carrying the weight of certainty. "Lawson's finished. He'll never see the outside of a cell again." His words had the ring of a promise. Emily released a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around the cup. "And the others?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile as tissue paper. "We're rounding them up," Reynolds confirmed, spreading photos across the table with practiced precision. "Lawson's empire is crumbling. His entire network is exposed. We've already made 3 more arrests this morning." And Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small recorder, the device feeling heavier than its actual weight. "There's more," he said, sliding it across the table. "Owen Keating's final statement. He recorded everything before." He trailed off, remembering how Keating had sacrificed himself to buy them time, taking bullets meant for them. Reynolds pressed play, and Keating's gravelly voice filled the room, detailing years of corruption, missing persons cases, and covered-up crimes. Emily closed her eyes, her hands trembling around the coffee cup as the familiar voice brought back memories she'd rather forget. "The FBI is taking over the investigation," Reynolds said, clicking off the recorder with a decisive snap. "This goes deeper than anyone imagined. Multiple jurisdictions, possible connections to other cases across state lines. They're sending a task force." Emily stared at the scratched surface of the metal table, tracing one long groove with her eyes. "So it's really over?" The question hung in the air, heavy with hope and disbelief, like a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. Jack nodded, reaching over to squeeze her shoulder gently, but he could see the shadows in her eyes, the way she still flinched at sudden movements. Some wounds would take longer to heal than others. They both knew that truth all too well. As they left the station, a wave of reporters descended on them like hungry wolves, their voices creating a wall of noise. Camera flashes exploded in their faces as microphones thrust forward, creating a forest of extended arms. Jack instinctively moved to shield Emily from the onslaught, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "Emily, how does it feel knowing your father risked everything for you?" A reporter shouted above the chaos, her voice cutting through the din like a knife. Emily froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, then did something unexpected. She reached out and gripped Jack's hand tightly, her fingers intertwining with his, seeking anchor in the storm. "It's over," she murmured, just loud enough for him to hear, and he felt her trembling slowly begin to still. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden table where Emily sat. Jack paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of his daughter. Still here, still real, not just another dream that would fade with consciousness. The coffee maker gurgled softly in the background, filling the house with its familiar aroma, mingling with the sweet scent of morning dew drifting in through the slightly open window. For the first time in 5 years, Jack had slept through the night without jolting awake, reaching for his gun, or calling out Emily's name into an empty room. The peaceful rest felt foreign, almost unsettling in its completeness. Emily didn't look up as he entered, completely absorbed in the leather-bound photo album spread before her. Her fingers traced the edges of a faded Polaroid. Emily at 7, missing her front teeth, Marie's arms wrapped around her from behind. The corners of the photo were worn soft from years of handling, its colors taking on that distinctive vintage haze. "Tell me about Mom," Emily said quietly, still studying the photograph, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack settled into the chair beside her, his coffee forgotten. A sad smile tugged at his lips as memories washed over him, bringing both joy and heartache. "She was the strongest person I knew. Stubborn as hell, too. Probably where you get it from." Emily's lips quirked up slightly, a ghost of recognition flickering across her face. "She used to sing while she cooked," Jack continued, his voice growing softer, thick with emotion. Terrible voice, but she didn't care. "And she'd dance around the kitchen with you standing on her feet." Sometimes you'd both get so caught up in it, dinner would burn and we'd end up ordering pizza. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as they touched Marie's face in the photo, trying to bridge the gap between the image and her fractured memories. I wish I remembered her. Jack placed his hand over Emily's, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers. She's in you, kid. Whether you remember or not. I see her every time you smile, every time you get that determined look in your eye. The way you scrunch your nose when you're thinking hard, that's all her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Emily closed the album with a gentle thud. She turned to face the window, studying her reflection in the morning light, her features half illuminated by the golden glow. Do you think... She hesitated, uncertainty creeping into her voice. I can get my old life back? Jack watched his daughter carefully, seeing both Emily and Anna in her features. The girl she was and the woman she'd become through necessity and survival. The shadows under her eyes spoke of countless nights spent running, while the set of her jaw showed a strength that had never been there before. You don't have to be who you were, he said gently. You can be who you want to be now. Take the best parts of both lives and make something new. Emily nodded, but Jack could see the fear lingering in her eyes as she continued to stare at her reflection, searching for answers in her own face. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the table, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood that even memory loss couldn't erase. The setting sun painted the cemetery in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Jack walked slowly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path, with Emily close beside him. The evening air was cool and still, carrying the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass and late summer flowers. A gentle breeze rustled through the nearby maple trees, their leaves starting to show hints of autumn colors. They stopped at Marie's grave. The headstone was simple but elegant, just like she had been. Marie Elizabeth Hollister, beloved wife and mother, read the inscription. Emily knelt down, her fingers tracing each letter with gentle reverence. Fresh flowers placed by the groundskeeper that morning added a splash of color against the gray stone. Jack cleared his throat, fighting back the familiar tightness. Last time I was here? His voice wavered slightly. I thought I'd lost everything, both of you. He stuffed his hands in his pockets, remembering those dark days after Marie's death when grief had nearly consumed him. The weight of those memories still pressed heavy on his shoulders, even now. Emily remained silent, her hand still resting on the cool marble. After a long moment, she spoke softly. I don't remember her, but I feel like I should. Her voice carried a hint of frustration, of longing for memories just out of reach. She brushed away a stray leaf that had settled on the headstone. Jack placed a steady hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. She would have been proud of you, Em. So proud. He meant it. Marie would have been amazed by their daughter's strength, her resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances. The thought of how much Marie had missed, and would miss, made his heart ache. I'm still figuring out who I am, Emily whispered, finally looking up at him. The setting sun caught the tears in her eyes, making them shine like amber. A small bird landed nearby, its song breaking the evening silence. Jack smiled down at her, his heart full of love and hope. You'll get there. The words came easily, naturally, filled with all the faith he had in her. They stood together for a while longer, watching the shadows lengthen across the cemetery grounds. A distant church bell chimed the hour, its deep tones echoing across the peaceful setting. Finally, they turned and walked back toward the car, their footsteps falling in sync on the gravel path. Just before they reached the vehicle, Emily stopped suddenly. She turned to face Jack, determination written across her features. I want to remember, she said firmly. All of it. Her hands were clenched at her sides, showing the same stubborn resolve he remembered from when she was little. Jack nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love for his daughter's courage. Then we'll take it one day at a time. He opened the car door for her, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Emily stood in the doorway of her old bedroom, her hand resting on the familiar wooden frame. The room was exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago. Pink walls, white curtains dancing in the evening breeze, and a bookshelf stuffed with well-worn paperbacks. Everything was preserved, like a museum of a life she couldn't quite remember. She stepped inside slowly, her fingers trailing along the edge of her old desk. A thin layer of dust had settled on everything, but underneath, she could see the marks and scratches that told stories she couldn't recall. A coffee stain on the corner, a heart carved into the wood. Jack watched from the doorway, his heart aching as he observed his daughter rediscovering her own space. Emily picked up an old book from the desk, its spine cracked from frequent use. "Did I used to love this?" she asked softly, running her fingers over the faded cover. Jack chuckled, the sound warm and gentle. "You used to read it every night, sometimes twice. You said the characters felt like friends." Emily smiled faintly, carefully turning the pages. The book felt right in her hands, somehow familiar, yet foreign. "I wish I could remember," she whispered, more to herself than to Jack. Jack stepped into the room, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. "Memories or not, you're home now." His voice was thick with emotion, years of pain and hope wrapped up in those simple words. Emily set the book down carefully, exactly where she'd found it. She turned to face Jack, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Dad?" The word felt strange on her tongue, but right, natural. Jack paused, that single word hitting him harder than any bullet ever could. 5 years of emptiness and searching, and here she was, calling him Dad again. Emily took a shaky breath. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Jack pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "Never," he whispered fiercely. Emily melted into the embrace, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she finally felt like she belonged, like she was truly home. And Jack, holding his daughter close, knew with absolute certainty that they were finally free. The shadows that had haunted them for so long were gone, replaced by the warm glow of hope and healing. The sizzle of bacon and warm morning light filled Jack's kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee, watching as Emily stood at the stove, confidently flipping pancakes. Her movements were natural, as if she'd done this 100 times before. Jack leaned against the counter, a mix of surprise and pride on his face. "Didn't know you could cook." Emily smirked, sliding another perfect golden pancake onto a growing stack. "Neither did I. Turns out, muscle memory is a thing." The kitchen felt different with her there, warmer somehow, more alive. Jack watched as she navigated the space with increasing confidence, finding utensils and plates without having to ask where they were. "You're burning your bacon," Emily pointed out, not looking up from her pancakes. Jack rushed to save the crackling strips. "Hey, I've managed just fine on my own." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call those charred eggs I saw yesterday? 2 weeks back and you're already bullying me?" Jack grinned, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Emily's laugh, her first real laugh since returning, filled the kitchen. The sound made Jack pause, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He'd forgotten how much he'd missed that sound. They sat down together at the small kitchen table, passing syrup and butter back and forth. For a moment, it felt wonderfully normal, just a father and daughter having breakfast together. No conspiracies, no running, no lost memories. Emily took a bite of pancake, then set her fork down carefully. "I think I want to get a job," she said. "Start fresh." Jack looked up from his plate, studying her face. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She pushed her pancakes around thoughtfully. "I want to figure out who I am, outside of everything that's happened." Jack reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then let's take it one step at a time." Emily squeezed back, managing a small smile. "Thanks, Dad." Emily sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the contents of an old cardboard box. Childhood photos spilled across the carpet, birthday parties, school plays, family picnics. Her fingers traced the edges of each image, studying the smiling girl she used to be. The photos felt both familiar and foreign, like looking at someone else's life through a foggy window. She lifted another handful of memories from the box: report cards, movie ticket stubs, dried flowers pressed between pages. Then her hand brushed against something soft and worn. The leather was cracked in places but still supple. Her old jacket. Emily's breath caught as she pulled it free. The weight of it felt right in her hands. Without thinking, she slipped it on. The leather settled around her shoulders like an old friend. A wave of comfort washed over her, and with it came something else. A memory, faint but clear. She was sitting in Jack's truck, the leather seats creaking beneath her. Country music played softly on the radio. Jack's fingers tapped against the steering wheel, keeping time with some old Willie Nelson song. The summer air rushed through open windows, carrying the scent of pine trees. She remembered laughing at something he said, the sound bright and carefree. Emily closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. But they weren't sad tears. For the first time since coming home, something felt completely real. She stood up slowly, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. Her feet carried her to the living room where Jack sat in his usual chair, reading the evening paper. The leather creaked softly as she settled onto the couch beside him. "I remember something," she said quietly. Jack lowered his paper, his eyes questioning. "The way you used to tap the steering wheel," Emily continued, "when we drove together. You always did it to those old country songs you loved." Jack's throat worked for a moment before he could speak. "You do?" Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I think I do." Jack's hands trembled slightly as he pulled the old shoebox from the top shelf of the closet. Dust motes danced in the evening light filtering through the curtains. He hadn't touched these videos in years, couldn't bear to watch them after Emily's supposed death. Now, with his daughter sitting on the couch, wrapped in her old leather jacket, the moment felt right. "I kept everything," he said softly, settling beside her. "Every birthday, every school play." Emily watched as he pulled out a handful of VHS tapes, each labeled in Marie's neat handwriting. Her mother's familiar script made her breath catch. Jack selected one marked Emily, age 7, and slipped it into the old VCR player. The screen flickered to life with a slight crackle of static. Then suddenly, there she was, a little girl with pigtails flying behind her as she ran through a sun-drenched field, her laughter pure and uninhibited. The camera shook slightly as it followed her movement, Marie's voice calling out encouragement from behind the lens. "That's really me?" Emily asked, leaning forward. The girl on screen looked so carefree, so completely at home in her own skin. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "You were always running somewhere. Couldn't keep you still for more than a minute." He chuckled softly. "You told everyone you were going to be the fastest kid in Redwood Falls." Emily smiled, watching her younger self collapse in a giggling heap in the tall grass. "Maybe I should try running again," she mused. "See if I still have that speed." "You'd probably still leave me in the dust," Jack said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You always did." They watched in comfortable silence as more memories played across the screen. Emily blowing out birthday candles, performing in her third-grade play, teaching their old dog Max to fetch. Each moment felt like a piece of herself slowly clicking back into place. As the tape ended, Emily rested her head against Jack's shoulder. The familiar scent of his aftershave brought back another flash of memory, him carrying her to bed after she fell asleep watching movies. "Thank you," she whispered, "for never giving up on me." Jack pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Never, kid." Emily closed her eyes, feeling truly at peace for the first time since coming home. Here, in this moment, she finally felt like she belonged. If you enjoyed the story of Jack, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.